Hello, I'm Heather Granato from Informa and Vitafoods. Welcome to Vitafoods Europe 2022 here in Geneva. So excited to have you back with us. Also to our online audience, we've got live streaming of our sessions from all of our theaters, so thank you for being here. The show floor will be open today until 6. We're open tomorrow at 9:30. I hope you have a chance to make it around the expo hall, see all the exciting and innovative ingredients that are out there. But as you are joining us here, I think you're probably interested in today's topic on market access and compliance of well-being and mental health nutraceuticals with Nicholas Carbonell, partner, congratulations, at Bird & Bird. So he works in the regulatory and administrative practice in Brussels and is a member of the International Life Sciences and Food and Beverage sector groups, providing hands-on advice and assistance to clients in public, administrative, and regulatory law matters. And we will have a little time for questions at the end. For our online audience, feel free to chat those in. And Nicholas, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather, for a nice introduction, and thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for attending indeed. Well, I think I'm not the only one feeling really good about having in-person events again. We've been through a lot, and I think we've all become a bit bored of only online events or always being hidden behind screens and cameras. So it's clearly a fact that the pandemic has had a profound impact on our lives. And clearly there is a link also between what we have all been through and the focus of my presentation today. We've been through a lot, indeed, and the attention to mental health and well-being has, in fact, never been so strong as it is today. But in fact, the topic is absolutely not new. There has always been a well-known link between, sorry about this, it shouldn't be like this, but there's always been a link between what we eat and how we feel. We all know about certain, ancient and traditional wisdom. We all know there is food that is good for us, food that is less good for us. We feel much better after a bar of chocolate, but that's probably, we are less keen to admit that. But besides these traditional approaches to good for you food, the added value of supplementation and of the use of nutraceuticals for the purpose of well-being and mental health is getting more and more attention over time. And even if it can be seen as a variation on the same theme, well, actually, the recourse to supplementation for health and well-being purposes is in fact an emerging segment. From a regulatory perspective, it's relatively new. It's something that was not really a focus of attention until the recent years. And for that reason, as we will see, it faces a number of particular challenges that need to be considered when developing a new product or preparing the launch of such product. So what I would like to share with you today is in fact my perspective on these issues, on these particular issues that the mental health and well-being supplementation segment is facing. And these views, well, I've gathered from my practice, basically. As Heather said, I'm a regulatory lawyer, and therefore I have some practical perspective on this, and hopefully I can share a little bit of tips regarding the bringing of these types of nutraceuticals to the EU market in particular. And as I was saying, the attention that it receives from the public makes mental health and general well-being actually one of the biggest trends in the nutraceuticals market. So no wonder that we see so many new products being showcased here at Vitafoods. And it's interesting to see the proportion of products that are aimed at some part, or in a way, to some extent, at increased well-being or addressing some mental health issues or concerns of the consumers. But in fact, there is more to it, because what consumers demand is not only supplements that make them feel good and healthy, they are also demanding, and that's a more general trend, of course, but more natural solutions, and they are also looking for solutions that can be combined with more usual or more traditional forms of treatments for health conditions. And that, in fact, in itself, triggers a number of questions that are relatively crucial in terms of regulation and compliance. Because, and we will discuss that, of course, in the course of the presentation, but to an extent, the fact that we have these trends and these demands and these requirements from consumers is in fact blurring the lines, or trying to move slightly the lines between traditional product classifications in accordance with the regulatory framework. And we can see that more and more, and that brings new challenges in product development and launch of new solutions. So we have evoked that already a little bit. So what are these trends, if you try to summarize them? And obviously this is not market analysis perspective, it's a lawyer's perspective on based on what I'm seeing in the requests that I'm receiving. But if you try to summarize things, and if you try to understand what they mean in terms of business implications and from a business perspective. Of course, I evoked in the intro the general context of the pandemics, which has confirmed and in fact strengthened certain pre-existing trends. A lot of consumers are experiencing personal and professional stress, also combined to an extent with sleep deprivation, or at least disruption of sleep. But at the same time, there are other trends, because this is a little bit negative, but on the positive side, well, we have generations at the moment that are experiencing longer life expectancy, that adapt their lifestyle, that remain active, that want to remain active and to have as healthy a life as possible in order to optimize healthy aging. So that's the broad brush on a few of the relevant market trends. But because they are very strong trends, it also means, in fact, that this translates into a lot of business efforts in order to encounter those trends. And that means that the market of well-being and mental health is, in fact, more and more competitive. And in a competitive environment, what is needed, of course, is constant innovation and a need for businesses to differentiate from the others, to make sure that their products are recognizable, that they stand out of the others that are on the market. So in fact, we can see that so as a result of this, we can see a number of innovative formulations being brought to the markets. They combine various compounds, some innovative, some less so, some new dosages, some new combinations. And there is also, of course, because it's a massive trend and a trend that is intended to respond to a consumer demand, there is also, on the side of the authorities, more and more scrutiny and enforcement as they oversee the market and the practices that are being developed on the market. Now, interestingly as well, because it's an innovative market, we can see that certain compounds used in formulations do receive some kind of attention, and I want to do a kind of a parenthesis on three examples. Because what I notice is that in particular in the well-being and mental health space, we have, it might be a coincidence, but we have a number of compounds that are really, if you look at it, on a kind of a battleground for scientific and legal debate. And here, I mentioned on this slide examples. It's not exhaustive, it's not meant to be, but I mentioned here 3 examples, namely CBD, so cannabinoids, obviously, aloe vera, and GABA, so gamma aminobutyric acid. And I've chosen these 3 examples because I want to make essentially 3 points, 3 specific points on each of these, one for each of these. What I wanted to say about, because it illustrates actually a number of the challenges and difficulties and issues that the mental health and well-being space encounters in particular. In relation to CBD, not going to explain the whole status of CBD, it's been quite a journey, we could spend a day on that, but there has indeed been quite an evolution in the regulatory position about this ingredient, and in fact it has led to a fragmented and complex regulatory landscape for these products. Now, in the EU, as most of you are probably aware, the position is now relatively clear. That's already a good thing, but obviously we could have been spared with the journey until where we are now. And it's clear that the market is probably going to be structured, at least in part, around those of the novel food applications that will prove successful at the end of the process. But what I wanted to mention here is that, in a way, Brexit has allowed to identify diverging approaches that, unfortunately, in a way, show that there are more pragmatic ways of handling certain issues than others. In the EU, because of the hesitations and the back and forth on the status of CBD, the businesses have, at the moment, not known anymore where they could be going with their products. And in the UK, the market was quite similar, but the business offer was there, the consumer demand was there, and instead of taking an approach, as in the EU, saying, well, these products cannot remain on the market until there is a novel food approval in place, talking, of course, about the products that do qualify as a novel food here. Well, the UK authorities took a much more pragmatic view that allowed to, in fact, find a balance between the interests of business and the consumer's needs. And this pragmatic approach has been to, in fact, do some kind of survey of the market to understand what products were there and to assess those of which could legitimately stay on the market until a decision would be made. And interestingly, this corresponds, mutatis mutandis, with the transitional regime that is provided for under the European Novel Food Regulation, but that could not apply for temporal reasons to CBD. But the UK, in a way, kind of applied that and kind of grandfathered the presence of products on the market. That's what I wanted to say about CBD. Of course, there will be other questions about CBD. Don't hesitate after this presentation. GABA has nothing to do with CBD, obviously. What I wanted to highlight there is slightly indirectly related to the status of GABA. What I wanted to highlight is that there are really strong differences in market practices and in the use of certain compounds. GABA, for instance, is widely used in fortified foods in Japan. You may have heard that the first CRISPR-edited tomato is in fact a GABA-enriched tomato. It's been modified to have an increased level of GABA in the cherry tomato. And while in Europe, in most member states, knowledge about GABA is quite limited, and the support of the authorities for the use of GABA in supplements or in fortified foods is sometimes not super obvious. But the indirect link I wanted to make here is that, in fact, not only in the EU there is no claim, we'll come back to claims, obviously, health claims later on, but not only there is no claim in Europe authorized in relation to GABA, but even, as I mentioned, in Japan we have now gene-edited tomatoes containing GABA. Even the technology to produce these kind of things is currently highly debated in Europe. It's not related to GABA itself, don't take me wrong, but I wanted to highlight that in a way, even though Europe has always had the message that they try to create a level playing field with really the most advanced form of regulation, unfortunately on certain topics we are kind of lagging behind, and it will be interesting to see how these debates evolve, in particular around gene editing techniques. But that's really a parenthesis, if you allow me. Now, aloe vera, why is aloe vera mentioned here? Well, obviously because of the recent ban on HAD containing compounds in food supplements. Now, the issue, which has been adopted by the Commission, the issue is being debated in the Court of Justice in Luxembourg at the moment. But the reason I mention it here is simply because we were talking about innovation, we were talking about using innovative and different products in nutraceuticals. I wanted to highlight here that what is in the law today can change tomorrow, and it can change quite drastically and substantially. Therefore, there is a need to really monitor the evolutions in the regulatory landscape, which happens basically potentially every day. Now, this might be the most boring slide of this presentation. It's a snapshot of the regulatory landscape. Well, it's not exhaustive. What I want to say here is that, in fact, the regulatory landscape for nutraceuticals is getting more and more complex over the years. These on the slides are, in fact, some of the key instruments that are, in fact, the largest building blocks of regulation of nutraceuticals. But, in fact, numerous requirements do not even appear here because either they are in more specific texts or because they are enshrined in national legislation, because it's always important to remind that the EU market is not it's a single market economically, but from a regulatory perspective, there are a lot of divergences and points to be taken into account, because requirements, interpretations can vary from one member state to the other. So bringing, in fact, a nutraceutical product to the market in the EU will not only require compliance with EU law as such, but also with the relevant national requirements. So that's always something that needs to be taken into account on a case-by-case basis. So just maybe a few words on some of these texts, just so you can have an idea of what this all means in terms of bringing a nutraceutical to the market. Well, basically and fundamentally, the General Food Law, this is how it's nicknamed, in fact, that one requires that the business that brings the product to the market is registered as a food business and complies with all relevant food hygiene requirements. Now, General Food Law also requires a constant monitoring of what's going on the market and imposes relatively strong obligations on food businesses whenever an issue arises on the market. So if a problem arises, recalls or withdrawals from the market need to happen. And why do I mention that here? Well, obviously because we have all read the news and we know that it does not always go the right way. This news, these recent events, unfortunate and quite numerous lately, in fact, at the moment are reminding all food businesses that they need to have procedures and operational measures in place to make sure that they can meet their obligations in terms of food safety, and also that they need to have adequate internal or external training and preparedness within the company. Now, food information is also mentioned here. That's another very big building block, of course, of the EU regulatory framework applicable to nutraceuticals. Basically, this text there that is referred to defines all the general labeling requirements that apply to all foods, but just to mention that nutraceuticals are also subject to these requirements. And of course, there are also derogatory and specific rules specific to this nutraceuticals category. On that note, it's also important to mention so that not only the status of ingredients can change over time, but also the level of information that is actually required to convey to consumers is a notion that is also evolutive. There has been a recent ruling that is quite relevant for the topic of today, recent ruling of the Court of Justice, relating to the level of detail that needs to be provided about the vitamin formulations that are used in fortified foods. So the case concerned fortified foods, specific category, not food supplements. But the reason why I mention it is because what the court ruled, it was a request for a preliminary ruling, what the court ruled is that the list of ingredients and the labeling of a fortified food of course has to identify whether or not certain vitamins or minerals have been added, but it does not have to go as far as giving the source material that has been used for the presence of that vitamin or mineral. And we could think, well, that's quite obvious. Well, it's not that obvious because the Hungarian, so the national competent authority, in that case the Hungarian one, took the view that this element of information was in fact required. So that has been challenged by the food business. That proved to be right in court. But importantly, the case did concern fortified foods only. But the Advocate General, who issued an opinion on the case, made a comment in its opinion, in her opinion in that case, stating that the answer to the question, which was, do we need to give the full detail about the formulation of vitamins or minerals used in a product, they said, well, the question concerns here fortified food, but the answer that I gave, which is negative, might be different if the question was asked in relation to food supplements. The court didn't rule on that. It wasn't required from her to rule on this question, but it remains to be seen whether or not that topic will evolve. So again, something to be monitored. Now, turning to the legal and practical challenges, the numerous challenges that are met when bringing nutraceutical to market, and in particular a nutraceutical aimed at wellness and mental health. Well, first of all, ingredient suitability. In fact, you need to verify that all ingredients you want to put in your product will be suitable for use, that are admitted to be used in nutraceuticals in the EU, or of course, in the national markets where the product is intended to be placed. Because, as I mentioned, there are divergences between member states, and in particular in relation to the admissibility of certain ingredients. Second point you need to look at, product qualification. We are talking about nutraceuticals, and we often say nutraceuticals for food supplements. Well, in fact, the category is slightly broader. Legally speaking, nutraceutical is not defined, but we are talking about food supplements. We are talking about fortified foods in the regulatory framework. We are also talking about other categories that are really at the border with fortified food and food supplements in certain cases. You have cosmetics, but you also have medicinal products, which are completely subject to other rules. So, and in particular in relation to well-being and mental health nutraceuticals, you can really easily step into the limits of where you can be with a product that would still qualify as a food. And that's something you need to be aware of and be careful about when you position your product in terms of labeling and commercial communication more generally. Market access requirements will vary in function of the category your product belongs to. That's also important to keep in mind. But in fact, one of the most pressing challenges that applies to nutraceuticals in the context of mental health and well-being is in fact claims. The use of claims is highly regulated in the EU. We have seen on the previous slides that it forms subject matter of specific regulation, a full set of regulations, and in a nutshell, the system is based on a positive list, which means that only claims that are authorized previously can be used to communicate about a product or an ingredient. And it's only when a claim has been approved by the competent authorities that it can be used. The competent authorities in that case are the Commission, helped by EFSA. And the difficulty is that not so many claims relevant to the mental health and wellness space are currently authorized. That's the first problem. Second problem, well, because that's a fairly normal problem for an emerging category, but the second problem is that to get approval of new claims, you have a quite substantial level of evidence to be provided. And that means that generating the data you need to obtain the approval of new claim implies significant investment, potentially significant investment. But that also means that the legal protection of the data that is generated in that context is a critical issue. We'll have in the next session discussion on the protection of IP rights, but from a regulatory point of view, you also can use a number of tools that are provided for under the regulation. There is a regulatory data protection regime that applies to the data that is generated for the purpose of obtaining the approval of a new claim. And of course, you need to make sure you protect those data, not only using those tools, but also contractually. That's very clear. Because really, we are not talking about personal data here, but still, in the context of developing new claims, which are a really powerful tool to differentiate your products on the market, the data is really also, in that context, a kind of new oil. The use of these tools allows, in fact, adequate protection of the investment you make, but it also ensures and secures a competitive position on the market that allows to effectively differentiate your products from your competitors, and we have seen how important that is in this space. Data can also be needed in 2 seconds, be needed for other purposes, such as, for instance, making sure that the ingredients you are using do not qualify as novel food. Because as we said, if that is the case, then you will need to go through a very lengthy process to get approval. That also requires quite some substantial investments, and that's never part of a regular business plan, unless, of course, you are on this particular course. Now, we are reaching the end of this short journey.
Perfect. You've got 1 minute to go, Nick.
Fantastic.
Okay.
So what can we say at the end of this short journey? Well, what can we say about the mental health and well-being nutraceuticals space in terms of market access and regulatory compliance? Well, the least we can say is that the space is booming and it is more and more competitive. And while it is meant to respond to the changing and evolving consumer demand, it's also facing a number of critical challenges in terms of existing knowledge and evidence. And because the regulatory framework is not harmonized globally, and even not regionally, as I said, we need to look at really country-by-country basis, well, market entry strategies need to be well thought and need to include appropriate mechanisms to protect the investment that are required along the path to market. And from my lawyer's perspective, it's a very exciting space because it challenges the existing product regulatory categories and it raises fascinating questions in terms of compliance. So I hope that I managed to share some of that enthusiasm, and now in the few minutes that come, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicholas. A great presentation as always.